Welcome to Convention of States, a project of citizens for self-governance. Our spending and debt crisis. What can we do? As you recall, the first major abuse of the federal government that we just identified by Convention of States is the spending and debt crisis faced by our nation. This issue is probably the most recognized issue. But as we stated, our elected officials lack the courage and willingness to correct the problem. Time is running out. Our nation is trillions of dollars in debt without a credible plan to stop spending. The battle in Congress has escalated to a point where politics outweighs the cost of our economic future. And there is little hope our nation's leaders will make the tough choices that need to be made in order to rein in our debt and revive our economy. Today, America faces an uncertain economic future. Millions of Americans are unemployed, and some even suggest America faces a new normal in economic mediocrity. Spending ourselves into more debt won't solve that problem. In fact, doing so will only make it worse. Our objective today is to improve our understanding of the crisis and look at a suggested Article 5 Convention of States remedy that could put our nation back on the right track. Well, let's first understand some basic terms. Deficit. The government spends more than it collects in taxes in a single year. The money the government borrows then is added to the debt. Surplus. The government spends less than it collects in taxes in a single year. The extra tax revenue will go toward paying down the debt. By the way, do you know in the last 50 years how many times has the government experienced a deficit? Well, surprisingly, the answer to that question is 45 years of the last 50 years our government has had a deficit in spending. The last term that we need to understand is, in fact, federal debt. The total of all past budget deficits minus what has been repaid with surpluses. Even today, many politicians and media personnel still use deficit and the term debt incorrectly. Let's now look at what is happening. We're going to use the 2015 numbers since that is the last complete fiscal year. We might mention that a fiscal year runs from October 1 through September 30 of the following year. Okay, now let's get busy and break things down. Well, first, where does the money come from? The federal government raises trillions of dollars in tax revenue each year through a variety of taxes and fees. Some taxes fund specific government programs, while other taxes fund the government in general. Total federal revenues in fiscal year 2015 amounted to $3.18 trillion. These revenues come from three major sources: income taxes paid by individuals, 1.48 trillion or 47% of all tax revenues; payroll taxes paid jointly by workers and employers, a little over 1 trillion or 34% of all tax revenues; and the third category, corporate income taxes paid by businesses, or 11% of all tax revenues. Now let's look at overall federal spending. The U.S. Treasury divides all federal spending into three groups: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and interest on debt. Mandatory and discretionary spending account for more than 90% of all federal spending and pay for all the government services and programs. Interest on debt, which is a much smaller amount than the other two categories, is the interest the government pays on its accumulated debt. Note, mandatory spending is by far the largest group. So let's break spending down a little further. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress legislates outside of the annual appropriations process. Social Security, unemployment, and labor comprise 49%, while Medicare and health 38%, and all other programs 13%. Mandatory spending also includes widely used safety net programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and veterans benefits. Many mandatory program spending levels are determined by eligibility rules. Congress, therefore, does not decide each year to increase or decrease the budget for Social Security or other earned benefit programs. Instead, it periodically reviews the eligibility rules and may change them in order to exclude or include more people, or offer more or less generous benefits to those who are eligible, therefore changing the amount spent on that program. The projected growth of health care, Social Security, and interest is of grave concern, projected to consume 3/4 of the budget within 1 decade. Now let's look at discretionary spending. Discretionary spending refers to the portion of the budget that is decided by Congress through the annual appropriations process. By far, the biggest category of discretionary spending is spending on the Pentagon and related military programs. As you can see, those programs comprise 54% of total discretionary spending. The remaining 46% of discretionary spending covers a host of different programs and departments, like education, Pell Grants for low-income college students, National Science Foundation, and many others, as you can see listed. Well, let's now combine mandatory and discretionary spending and see what the breakdown looks like. As you can see, the spending by size, Social Security, unemployment, and labor, is the largest program, and it comprises 33% of total federal spending. Medicare and health, 27%. Interest on the debt, I might note, is right now at 6%. Then the military would be 16% of total federal spending, and all the other programs together comprise 18% of total federal spending. Remember, we noted earlier that the projection was that Social Security, health care cost, and interest would consume 3/4 of the budget in approximately a decade, while those programs, those amounts currently comprise 66% of total federal spending. So let's look at then 2015. Let's see how it all came together. Well, here's how 2015 added up. As you can see, we took in tax revenues in the amount of a little over $2 trillion. We had other tax revenues a little over $1.13 trillion. And those monies then were spent on interest on debt, 229 billion, discretionary spending 1.11 trillion, and mandatory spending, the biggest group, 2.45 trillion. You'll note that we had to borrow 583 billion. What does that mean? That means we had a deficit. In other words, our tax revenues were not sufficient to cover our expenditures. So the country had to borrow $583 billion through the credit markets in order to balance the budget. So that amount, 583 billion, was then added to the federal debt. So let's talk about debt. If you want to get a quick look at our national debt condition, go to usdebtclock.org. Now this slide is already out of date, as our current debt is now over $19.2 trillion. Another term we need to understand in this discussion is gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the value of all goods and services our economy produces in a given year. Well, the total national debt in 2015 reached $18.8 trillion. That exceeded 100% of this nation's GDP for 2015. Another alarmingly high amount that we need to understand is publicly held debt. That is the amount of debt that we have incurred through borrowing through national credit markets. And it is alarmingly high also at 74% of GDP. These high debt levels were last seen in the United States after World War II. High federal debt puts the United States at risk for a number of harmful economic consequences, including slower economic growth, a weakened ability to respond to unexpected challenges, and possibly a debt-driven financial crisis. Our debt projection is not good, and time is running out to get this corrected. Publicly held debt, if you recall, that's the amount of debt that we've incurred through borrowing through credit markets, is projected to rise significantly again after 2016, from a current 74% of GDP to 100% by 2030. Folks, that's only 14 years from now. Most of this projected increase in debt will come from mandatory spending, or the entitlement programs. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are so large and growing that they are on track to overwhelm the federal budget. The major entitlements and interest on the debt are on track to devour all tax revenues in fewer than 20 years. Well, who do we owe money to? About a third of our debt is money the Treasury has borrowed from itself, like from Social Security trust funds and other funds. The remaining two-thirds of our debt is considered public debt. If you recall, that's debt borrowed through credit markets, with the largest portion owed to international investors, while the rest is owed to various other types of investors. So who do you think might be the two top international investors? Well, our answer came from actually 2014 numbers, but here is the breakdown of international investors, and you might know China and Japan are by far leading the list of international investors. So here we are. The question now is, what can we do about this situation? Well, as we seek a remedy, we need to understand the importance of enumerated powers in the Constitution, and that our founders had specific opinions on federal spending as relates to enumerated powers. James Madison's view was that spending should be limited to the enumerated powers of Congress. Alexander Hamilton's view was similar to Madison, but went beyond enumerated powers to include things of national interest and where states had no jurisdiction. So this understanding of how our founders felt about federal spending will form part of the basis for our suggested remedy. Well, going a little further on the enumerated powers concept, here is a partial list of constitutional enumerated powers. The actual list numbers 35. As an example from this list, Congress may spend money on naval operations because providing and maintaining a navy is an enumerated power delegated to Congress. It can be found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8. But Congress should not be authorized to appropriate funds for Swedish massages for rabbits, not a constitutional enumerated power. And Congress should not be authorized to appropriate funds for watching grass grow, not a constitutional enumerated power. These examples are, in fact, of actual spending, and while somewhat comical, unfortunately represent some of our spending problem. Now let's complete the suggested remedy by borrowing some suggestions from Mark Levin's book, Liberty Amendments. Well, to complete our suggested spending and debt remedy, first of all, we recommend, of course, an Article 5 Convention of States for the purpose of amending the Constitution. We would suggest amendments that would further define spending to correspond with the views of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Also, to adhere to the 10th Amendment. We're now going to borrow some suggestions from Mark Levin's book, Liberty Amendments. In his book, he suggests that if a budget is not signed to begin October 1, the beginning of the fiscal year, an across-the-board 5% reduction in expenditures from the prior year's fiscal budget shall be imposed. Total outlays for any fiscal year shall not exceed receipts for that fiscal year. Total outlays for fiscal year shall not exceed 17.5% of the nation's GDP for the previous year. Total receipts shall not include those derived from borrowing, nor shall total outlays include repayment of debt principal. Any of the above may be suspended for 1 year, but would require 3/5 approval vote of both houses of Congress. Debt limit increases. Now, this is a topic that we did not cover here, but Congress does establish debt limits for this country. Debt limit increases require a 3/5 vote of both houses of Congress. This amendment shall take effect in the 4th fiscal year after ratification. In other words, there would be a transition period to incorporate these amendments. Once again, these are only suggestions, and final amendments would be determined at the Article 5 Convention of States. Well, in closing, I'd like to leave you with this quote. The founders gave us a legitimate path to save our liberty by using our own state governments to impose binding restraints on the federal government. It is time to dust off the tool the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started. Thank you, folks.